Good evening and a warm welcome to Rushcliffe Borough Council's Growth and Development Scrutiny Group meeting. I'd like to remind everyone that the meeting is being recorded and live streamed on the Council's YouTube channel. In addition, under the relevant regulations, other people may film, record, tweet or blog from this meeting, and the use of such images or sound recordings is not under the Council's control. May I remind councillors to please switch off your microphones when you're not speaking. Thank you. And by way of introductions, officers with us this evening: Catherine Evans, Service Manager, Economic Growth and Property; Richard Mapletoft, Planning Policy Manager; and Tracy Coop, Democratic Services Officer. So onwards. First item on the agenda is apologies for absence.
Thank you, Chair. We have apologies from Councillor Cotty, and we have Councillor Reagan as a substitute, and we've got apologies from Councillor Matthews with Councillor Wheeler as a substitute. And I think Councillor Della may have sent her apologies. That's okay. Thanks.
Thank you. Are there any declarations of interest in relation to this evening's agenda? No. So move on to the minutes of the previous meeting, which was in July. Does anybody have any comments on them, or somebody like to propose them as an accurate record of the meeting? Thank you, Councillor Chewings and Councillor Butler. All those in favour? Thank you. So on to the first substantive item of the evening, which relates to development and infrastructure. This comes before us after a scrutiny matrix request from Councillor Clark, and with a recommendation that we consider the contents of the report and whether there are further related matters that we wish to consider at future meeting or meetings. So with no further ado, hand over to Richard.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, as Councillor Walker set out, as set out in the report, I'm just going to run through with the particular issue is how the borough works with partners to plan for infrastructure required to support growth. Right. I think that probably the background to this scrutiny request was the fact that we have significant planned housing and employment and other growth within Rushcliffe, and the general view is that needs to be supported by appropriate infrastructure. That is whether that's existing infrastructure that we already have or new improved infrastructure on the back of that new development. Overall, a significant part of the planning process that we are involved with at the Borough Council involves working with infrastructure providers and operators to firstly identify what those requirements are for new infrastructure in association with new development, and then ultimately to secure that delivery alongside new development. Just to give you a bit of sort of context in respect of national planning policy as relates to infrastructure. So the national planning policy framework that we've had in existence for sort of a decade or so, gets updated quite regularly, sets out the government's requirements in respect of planning and sets out what we should be looking to achieve. Very much identifies that new development should be supported by appropriate infrastructure. It's very clear in the NPPF. The government is clear that the delivery of sustainable development includes seeking to align growth and infrastructure provision. That's very much a sort of central part of what they determine to be sustainable development. And explicitly in respect of local plans, which is obviously my area of sort of interest, there needs to be early engagement and ongoing engagement and proportionate engagement, and ultimately it needs to be effective between us as the plan makers, the Borough Council as the plan makers, and all the relevant infrastructure providers and operators. There are a few quite important regulatory requirements as relate to infrastructure provision on the back of new development. Probably the most key is that we can only seek new infrastructure on the back of new development where it is justified to mitigate the impacts of otherwise unacceptable development. So what we can't do is ask for infrastructure over and above what is reasonable and necessary. So the regulatory framework that we operate within sets out 3 statutory tests that are known sort of otherwise as the planning obligation test, developer contribution test. So yes, first being that it has to be necessary to make the development acceptable in planning terms. Secondly, that it's directly related to development. So clearly, if you are providing a school, it has no bearing to the people who live in that scheme, then that wouldn't necessarily be directly related to that development. And ultimately, it needs to be fairly and reasonably related in scale and kind. So if you had a development of 10 houses, you couldn't necessarily on the back of that request a new primary school, clearly. Just going to introduce the infrastructure delivery plan. This is something we have in the past and we are at the current time prepared as part of the local plan preparation process. So it's quite a significant body of work that we undertake as part of the local plan. So what it does is ultimately identifies what infrastructure is required to support the growth that we're coming forward with respect to the local plan, critically when it's required, and then ultimately how it will be funded and delivered to support new development that we're proposing through the local plan. The IDP, we don't just sort of sit there and make it up off the top of our heads. We have a lot of engagement with, a multitude of infrastructure providers and operators. So, a few examples there, but pretty key ones. County Council, obviously, is the Education Authority, Local Highway Authority, very important. National highways, we have a couple of trunk roads going through Rushcliffe, A52, well, 3 actually, A52, A453, A46. So any impacts on that route network, any improvements to that highway infrastructure, they need to tell us about, and we need to tell them what we're doing, and ultimately make sure that any improvements that need to take place on those routes come about on the back of that new development. Healthcare providers, clearly important. New people into the area put additional pressure on GPs, on the local hospitals and a variety of other health facilities. So we engage with them, ask them what the pressures are, where there are shortfalls in the existing infrastructure. And then also others such as emergency services, ambulance, police, fire services, ultimately need to serve those new communities. So we need to know where there are deficiencies in the existing infrastructure and how we might, through new development, help to improve those to ultimately align development with infrastructure provision. It works both ways clearly because we're telling them what we're doing. So in turn, the IDP helps to inform their decisions, their infrastructure programme decisions over future years. So as I sort of already outlined, the IDP outcomes very much inform the local plan policies and proposals. So any critical infrastructure that we identify through the IDP process, we then set out within the context of the local plan. So it is all listed in there. So there's a big long sort of appendix within the core strategy we adopted in 2014 with all the critical infrastructure and which particular schemes that relates to. Any site-specific policies within the plan, we have a number within the core strategy and then also a number within local plan part 2, sets out where it is a explicit local plan requirement that a new school, for instance, is delivered alongside a new development that we're allocating in that plan, or, for instance, new highway improvements and a host of other requirements we will set out in there. And then when we get to the decision-making stage, ultimately those decisions have to be in accordance with the local plan, unless there are reasons otherwise. Infrastructure providers and operators, as they were with the IDP, ultimately get to comment on the draft plan. So if they're unsatisfied with what we're proposing, they will comment on it as they have done, and then we will seek to remedy those sort of concerns with them. And then ultimately, before the plan's adopted, it has to go before a planning inspector who scrutinises it. And one of those scrutiny questions is, are the growth proposals and the infrastructure that we're either have already or we're seeking to approve, are they aligned so that it is ultimately sustainable growth? I highlighted this in the report. It's just one particular example, I think, where we've done, and I was personally involved with a lot of work to sort of ensure appropriate new infrastructure on the back of new developments. Is we prepared an A52, A606 improvement developer contribution strategy. So this was involving extensive work between ourselves, National Highways, who have responsibility over the A52, and also County Council as the local highway authority, So we undertook quite a lot of assessment work in respect to transport modelling and other bits and pieces to, in part, establishing what work was required, to establish probably quite critically how much it was all going to cost, and then to effectively establish what proportion of the impact that new development would have on that network, and ultimately how much they should pay for. So on the back of that, we came up with a strategy about 10 years ago, and it's been updated more recently, to effectively say what proportion of impact on particular junctions is dependent on particular schemes. And then those schemes have to, on a pro rata basis, pay into those improvements. So I mean, you're probably well aware that that work's ongoing at the moment. We've had all the improvements through Radcliffe, at Stragglethorpe, and then more recently at the Gamston Island. And then there's going to be the improvements at Wheatcroft and Nottingham Night over the next few years, hopefully. And all of those junctions, to some degree, are paid for by developer contributions. We've either got in already, or we are due to get as part of the new schemes. So I would say that was quite a sort of good example of where we've worked very closely with the infrastructure providers to make sure development isn't causing undue impact. Yeah, I'm not from the planning application team, but and they'd probably give you a lot more detail if somebody was here from that team, but just sort of skirt through a bit of the detail. And clearly those that have been involved in planning committee know perhaps as much as I do, but plan applications, as with the local plan process, it's a continuation. There still needs to be extensive engagement with infrastructure providers and operators, both at the pre-application stage, which can be extensive, particularly in respect to big applications, and then clearly at the plan application stage. Not necessarily every application, but those that have infrastructure implications. For allocated sites, so the big sites, Gamston, Clifton, Edwalton, Sharp Hill, as already explained, a lot of engagement at the local plan stage, and then that just continues as we get into the pre-app and then plan application stage later on. Goes into a level of detail that's probably more extensive at that stage. Local plan identifies broad requirements, bit of detail. When you get to the application stage, it all pretty much needs to be firmed up. So it's very much, again, it's about the what, the when, and the how that new infrastructure will be delivered. And ultimately, generally speaking, that then gets sort of established within a Section 106 legal agreement that's entered into between the Borough Council, sometimes the County Council, and the developers, where it's all set down in legal terms, what's required, how it's going to be delivered, and how it's going to be paid for. And that might be provision through a financial contribution, particularly if it's off-site provision. But if it's on-site in particular, it might be direct delivery of a new primary school, for instance, by the developers themselves. And then the Section 106 will have all the legal sort of requirements in terms of trigger points for when that has to be delivered. It might be you deliver it on the X number, you know, it might be after the 100th house or whatever else. But again, as with local plan, and probably more so with the plan application process, those obligation tests, those plan obligation tests about necessity, directly related, fair and reasonableness, and related in scale and kind, are all very pertinent in respect to those discussions with the infrastructure providers and with the developers. I think this is the last slide. It's not necessarily going into the infrastructure levy in too much detail, because I think this group perhaps at some points in the recent future has gone through the SIL, but clearly a very important part of overall how we help to fund new infrastructure provision related to new development. So the SIL was introduced in October 2019. So it's a financial charge that's levied on most new developments above 100 metres squared, or where a new development is built, or any number of new dwellings. So the set charge that, roughly speaking, is about, I think, £90 per square metre. So on a big scheme, it can be quite a chunk of money. So that money, all the money that's collected, is used to fund certain predefined infrastructure requirements. Not all infrastructure, but we have a list of what needs to be paid for from SIL. So one particular example is off-site education contributions. Any SIL money is used to, expand the secondary schools locally. And SIL sits at the moment alongside Section 106 agreements in terms of how it operates. So not necessarily the clearest process. So Section 106 are negotiated on a case-by-case basis with each scheme, whereas SIL, where the development where it applies to that development is an absolute legal requirement. They just have to pay it. There is no get out. Preparation of the SIL that was adopted 4 years or so ago was pretty much heavily informed by the work that we put together in respect to the local plan and the IDP. So again, was set in place on the back of those extensive engagements with infrastructure providers. And the infrastructure providers and operators were engaged and consulted with as part of that preparation process. And if they had any sort of quibbles with that, we had to listen to them and make any changes to that. I put in the report, it's probably worth knowing just out of interest that the government are through the latest change, well, through the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill, are proposing new legislation that would bring into place a national infrastructure scheme that would effectively replace SIL. But it wouldn't be, it'll be similar, but I think it'll be, because at the moment SIL is only operated by certain authorities. We're one, but then, certain other ones, like the city don't have SIL, Broxton don't have SIL, but with the new levy, excuse me, all authorities would have to have a levy, but it would be prepared on the basis it's still set on a local charge level. We would have to have one, but I'm very uncertain exactly how that's going to play out and when it will come into force at the moment. Okay. So any questions?
Yeah, I'm sure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Richard. So over to members. Councillor Grocott.
Thanks, Chair. Just a quick question, Richard. Can you give a little bit more detail of the rationale? I mean, I can have a guess at some of it for the different zones in the SIL on the previous slides and what they meant. I don't know if you could bring it back up. Sorry, you stopped sharing that, Catherine. But that would be useful if you could explain some of the rationale around those, because I couldn't quite figure out the logic just from staring at the screen when it was up.
Yeah, the problem is I don't necessarily know in which order they come to, but I have a guess. Yeah, if you can see those. Yeah, well, ultimately, without necessarily saying which is which, in terms of there is a sliding scale of charges. So at the highest level, it's as I said, it was about £90, but it's probably gone up a bit through inflation. And the lowest level might be, I don't know, £40 per square metre. Yes, Councillor Walker sort of inferred there. Ultimately, it was done on the basis of land values, really, and what ultimately it was assessed that different development in different areas could afford based on the difference between land values and ultimate sales values.
One being the higher one, just checking.
Oh yeah, well I think so.
Well,
actually, no, not in that case. One is, I think one is Gamston. So that's the Gamston scheme. That actually is not. That's the only area of the borough that isn't SIL levied. There is a zero charge with respect to SIL in that location. One of the reasons in particular is because, as I mentioned, SIL is going to be used to fund secondary education. In respect to that scheme, the expectation is they will provide a secondary school on site. So in that instance, it wasn't fair to effectively clobber them twice for the same piece of infrastructure. So for the Gamston scheme, particularly because a lot of the infrastructure, secondary school, but also new primary schools and a whole host of other bits will be provided on site rather than off site. Part of the rationale for that was that therefore that SIL will be zero rated for development within that area. It's not zero rated on the Clifton scheme, which potentially could have been, principally because the Clifton scheme had got planning permission, I think, or was just about to at the time the SIL was approved. Yeah, so it had already effectively that ship had sailed. So it's not also paying any SIL because it was approved before SIL was introduced.
And those of us that were on the council last time when this process went through will have a little bit more knowledge and understanding than newer members, perhaps. Would it be helpful to ask for some briefing paper on the general specifics of SIL and how it works? And
that would be most welcome. Thank you, Chair.
Come to Councillor Solomon first, and then Councillor Butler.
Sorry, I was just going to flag out. I think we've got training on SIL and 106 next week, actually, which is going to be very useful. I think.
Well, I was going to touch on that, and I was just going to ask as well, that this will probably come as part of the training, that often wherever we are, if there are sort of largish developments going on, and that we know that there's been the big developments all around the borough, people quite understandably raise their concerns about, we need more money for the health service, we need more school places, all the rest of it, which we know is part of this process. Would it help, or maybe it's going to be covered in the training that you're going to do, to explain just how those figures are come to? So in other words, are there specific formulas, for example, involved that X number of new houses will create Y number of people and children, all the rest of it? So are we going to cover that, or I don't know if it's worth just mentioning that tonight, or?
Sorry, I'm not directly involved in the training next week, so I don't want to sort of build your hopes up or what's going to be covered, but we can certainly sort of discuss that with the officers involved, perhaps if it's not part of what they were going to cover. Yeah. I mean, it's possibly it's going to be more about how it operates now rather than sort of the history of it in terms of how we came up with it, because we're slightly separate to the current operation of it now.
Just quickly, I only really wanted to know the rationale for the geographical zoning. That's all. I'm familiar with SIL and Tax 106 and how it works. Just why those areas with those colours, if you like, and what each of those zones meant in terms of the actual contributions. Thanks.
Councillor Way.
Thank you, Chair. The stakeholders that you, sorry, I see right. The stakeholders that you have contact with are the big major stakeholders like health and highways and so on. Do you at any point have any contact and consultation with local what you might call minor stakeholders, so parish councillors and things like that? Because I feel there's a big difference between things like the Fareham, which is brand new and has got everything in it, and something where a large quantity of housing has been adding to an already consistent existing community, where the people who already live there and represent the people there have a better idea of what the issues are on the ground. And sometimes maybe we feel that their point of view could be listened to. For example, we get these spurious bus stops on various planning applications where really we have a pretty shrewd idea that there won't be a bus there, and not in the foreseeable future anyway. And also sometimes things are given, for example, one of the examples I could think of is play equipment, where it's very specific about where it should be placed and within what distance from the development. And that's, I'm speaking from experience here, that's not always the easiest thing to do. And you're put into a position where you can't actually commit to what their conditions are. And then there's the danger of actually losing that contribution, especially now with estates having their own local playing areas built by the developers. So my question really is, what sort of input can local communities add to this process? And actually going back to the matrix, one of the things on it was about the cumulative effect. And I think possibly that's where local knowledge would have a better idea of what the cumulative effect is of some of these developments. Long question, so.
And from the local plan side, I mean, particularly like as an outline, we prepared the infrastructure delivery plan. So if there were a particular issue where we thought we needed to engage with the local parish, for instance, because of some infrastructure provision that they might provide or be aware of, we would do that engagement, or we should do. But in the process, when we prepare that infrastructure delivery plan, we do present that as part of the evidence of the local plan. So, I mean, the problem is it's quite a hefty document, but it is there to be reviewed by whoever, not necessarily infrastructure providers, but, you know, parish councils, individuals, members of the public, whatever. to effectively see what the infrastructure providers have said and what we've agreed with them, or what we're sort of proposing on the back of that. And then that is, all there for scrutiny purposes. And as I said, we'll ultimately have to get past the planning inspector. So if a local community thinks that we have not addressed infrastructure provision on the back of development appropriately, there is plenty of scope to make those views made and ultimately try and get the plan changed. And I think possibly what you're talking about when you sort of refer to, siting of bus stops and whatever else, we then move beyond local plan process and we're into the detailed sort of discussions and decisions that are taken with respect to planning applications. I have to apologise, I'm not the best person to probably inform you, give you a view on that, because I'm not as so directly involved with those discussions as other colleagues within the planning team. But in terms of broad details in terms of provision, that should be there, all clearly part of the application plans and proposals and whatever else. So that's there when it comes in as a plan application. It should also be there if there are any changes as part of that that are there to be commented on. But clearly there are aspects, perhaps, and again I'll speak from a position of slight ignorance. I have to apologise about that, where there might be certain detail that is possibly sort of sorted out through just direct discussions between planning officers and highway officers, and then that sort of then sees the light of day without necessarily being something that you would have a chance to have a say on. I don't know. But ultimately, I would hope that most of the process is pretty, open for people to make comments on, most of the aspects of what we agree between the infrastructure providers and the developer and the local authority. But there may be instances, as you pointed out, where it's not always as transparent as you perhaps would hope it would be. I don't know.
It strikes me that the crux of this issue is about flexibility and the ability to adapt to changing circumstances. The local plan, the IDP process takes a long time to formulate in the first place. And when it's formulated, it looks a long way in the distance. Meanwhile, things change. There's often development that happens outside of the plan, sometimes on a fairly substantial scale or relatively substantial for an area. Other things like fluctuations in birth rate can have a big impact on school places that are or aren't required. So in that context, how can we adapt quickly if we need to?
Yeah, well, I would suggest that the process is very responsive. Well, whether it's very responsive, it is responsive to those changes. We don't just blindly continue with proposals and plans for infrastructure provision if clearly circumstances have changed. So the plan only goes so far, and as you say, Councillor Walker, it can only be right at that particular moment in time. And circumstances do change, school plans change, by the time we get to the detailed scheme. And some of the things that we're allocating might not be delivered for a long time after the plan has been set in place. So we have to recognise that. So ultimately, like with any planning decision, it's in accordance with what's in the plan, unless there are good material planning grounds for an alternative decision to be taken. So in respect of infrastructure provision, it's just the same. There will be changes in circumstances, and I would suggest that the process can respond to those. So, for instance, I think like at Rushcliffe-on-Trent, we set out for the plan, that between them, all the big, well, the reasonably big allocations made around Rushcliffe-on-Trent, between them, they should fund a new primary school and the location should be provided for a primary school. I think it's now materialised that that isn't necessary. So, effectively it's plan B, it isn't plan A anymore. And the process has responded to that. So the developers will still be contributing, but it'll be the cash will be used elsewhere because that's what the Education Authority have told us. So that happens all the time. Things change, and also, it's in a way it's a bit of the reason why the local plan won't go into that fine, absolute fine detail, because ultimately a lot of it would be potentially abortive work if we tried to get it all sort of bottomed out at that stage, because it can't really until we know what the detailed schemes are for particular sites. Because I mean, we only put, for instance, sort of the development will be around sort of a mark in the local plan. By the time you get to a plan application, there might be a bit more on site than you're expecting, or there might be a little less on site than you're expecting. And therefore, the infrastructure requirements have to be worked out on those specific details. And also, we don't necessarily know in terms of exact timing when certain houses will be delivered in, you know, will it be this year, will it be that next year? And that can have an important bearing on things like school places and whatever else. So, yeah, a lot of the work that my colleagues in the development management team do is finding out what the latest situation is, getting the views from the infrastructure providers and responding to that, and then putting the necessary details into Section 106 agreements. And even then, when you sign those Section 106 agreements, there needs to be, you know, potential caveats and also potential, you know, alternative plans if things don't necessarily pan out as they should do. I mean, and ultimately that's what, you know, good Section 106 agreement is about, that it can, if there is a chance that things may need to change, it can factor that in and then respond to that. But, you know, ultimately at the end of the day, life's not perfect and this process is never going to be perfect. So a lot of the decisions that we have to take and, you know, are made in terms of having a good punt at what we think the situation will be in the future. And sometimes it works perfectly, sometimes it works better than expected, but clearly there are going to be other instances where you know, what gets delivered isn't necessarily in hindsight the best thing that we could have done, but you are taking that view at that point based on hindsight, where before then you wouldn't necessarily know. Whether there should be anything done differently to what we do at the moment, I don't know if there necessarily should, but, you know, clearly there might be others who would have a view about things, you know, ways we could perhaps do things better. I don't know.
Councillor Solomon.
Thank you, Chair. Just trying to join a couple of the dots with Councillor Way's comments about existing development and an existing development with having new development added on and consultation with that, and the trackability of changes going forward. So I represent Newton Ward. We have a specific situation exactly like that in Newton, an existing development, and then the developers come in, and in fact, not just one developer, we're on our third developer having taken over, and it's been quite a complicated evolution. So, years ago it started, and I don't know what consultation went on at that time in terms of what the requirements were for infrastructure and the triggers placed on those. I don't know what the consultation was. I don't know if the parish council were particularly consulted with that. From my involvement with the parish council and now as borough councillor, my perception is that very little. So there are a number of really good infrastructure developments that should come in at Newton, particularly the footbridge, which is very, very wanted and needed to connect over to Bingham. But there is great frustration with locals, and particularly the parish council, in that as requirements and different developers have come in, variations have been made and trigger points altered. So the parish council's perception is that the trigger points for getting these items of infrastructure in place is from the original development, but now they're being told no, it starts again when the second developer took over, when the third developer took over, which is subsequently delaying, and the downturn in house building obviously affects that and pushes everything back. The parish council have engaged, and I have as well on their behalf, a number of times with the planning department to get some clarity on when those trigger points were changed, how they were changed, and who was consulted, because they certainly weren't. And it's all a bit, well, it's not transparent, and there is no answer that has come back to them, despite having asked a number of times. And you can appreciate that's incredibly frustrating. So I think certainly going forward, there needs to be some sort of summary or tracking of what happens when, who is accountable, and whether the local stakeholders have been consulted. Because the parish council in Newton's case were clearly not consulted, and they are very, very frustrated going forwards.
Yeah, well, it's difficult for me to comment on that particular scheme, because again, I'm not directly involved in it. You are talking about what decisions were made quite some time ago. I mean, I can only, take the comments away really, and, feed that through to colleagues.
Do that. Okay. So I'm going to come to Councillor Regan.
Thank you. I didn't, Chair. So I had 3 questions. I didn't put my hand up actually, but I was going to. So you almost anticipated. So I have lots of questions about SIL in section 106, which obviously I'll wait for the training session. And I have some specific questions about Bingham North, which is my ward, which you've just highlighted that you can't address specifics. But I have 3 general questions which sort of feed into that. So the first question is public. So what's the time frame that the IDP is available to the public, and what depth of engagement is it? Available online? Obviously, I'm sure it is, but is it available? Are there groups, consulting groups, or some meetings within the towns to give local residents the opportunity to understand and comment and discuss? Secondly, is there a schedule of SIL and 106, section 106 usage of funds and any residual funds? You can probably guess where that's going. And how, you may or may not be able to answer this, but how deeply, if you can get back to me, this would be very useful. How deeply was the Beaver Healthcare Group consulted? Because the expansion of Bingham has put a lot of pressure on the health centre, causing long delays and in people getting appointments. If you can address those first 2 points and possibly get back to me on the third, I'd appreciate that. No, so the local plan and the IDP.
Yeah.
Are they published? Obviously, they're published online, I assume. But are they in a public forum in the town centre? Are people aware of it? Because I'm seeing lots of questions come through social media in my inbox that, quite frankly, seem like they should have been addressed before the development started.
Yeah, in terms of public engagement as part of that process, we did for the existing local plan. So, I mean, ultimately, the existing local plan was adopted, the first part in 2014, and then the second part in 2019. In terms of public events, as part of the preparation of those two, we probably did 20 maybe, off the top of my head. So we do quite a lot of public meetings, exhibitions, coming to see local people. I mean, I have to say we don't necessarily get into the actual nitty-gritty of the IDP as part of that process. With all due respect, it would be quite hard to engage people at that level as part of those processes. But we go out, sort of introduce general, what we're about, what we're looking to do, get their views in sort of the early stages before we've come up with any plan policies and proposals, and then later on where we've drafted them up, councillors have agreed those, and we go out and ask people what they think about it. And the height of the core strategy process, we had a sort of database that probably had about 1/5 of the households in Rushcliffe were all part of that. If they've asked to be signed up, we write to them, we present all the evidence to them, they can go through it with a fine tooth comb, it's all there. So I would say that there is a lot of engagement as part of that process. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it does take the other side to sort of engage themselves with that, because we have to put together quite detailed evidence, quite detailed, and particularly in respect of infrastructure provision and what's viable, lots of sort of financial details, lots of thick documents. So people have to read through those. We do present those in summary in terms of the local planning committee reports and consultation documents, but it's all there ultimately if somebody wants to get involved and go through that process. And there are individuals who will do that, and then they come to the public examination last couple of weeks in front of planning inspector. And if they've got a grievance, if they've got a view of what we've done, they don't think it's fit for purpose. Certainly plenty of people who did that came along and got things sort of they were listened to by the examiner. So I would say, yes, that detail is looked at. With respect to your the infrastructure funding and how we report on that, my understanding is, and unfortunately it's not, apologies again, I don't want to sort of say this isn't my area of expertise, but we do as an authority, we do like an annual infrastructure funding statement that is a legal requirement, and it was introduced at the time of SIL to set out what we're getting in terms of SIL, what's in the bank, what it's being used on. And I think that I may need to be corrected if I am wrong, but that also does cover Section 106 contributions as part of that. So that information is published on an annual basis for people to sort of scrutinise what we're holding, what it's been spent on. I mean, ultimately, we're not usually the body that spends it. It usually gets transferred over to the likes of the county council for them to spend on secondary schools, primary schools, local roads. With respect to your third point about we consult quite significantly with the healthcare providers. And yeah, I mean, ultimately we do it with the sort of the more centralised body, like the commissioning group. Particular practices we try to do where we know about them, we'll consult those specifically. But unfortunately, sometimes with healthcare provision, it can change quite significantly in terms of who's responsible, who you need to talk to, from month by month sometimes. So whether we got it absolutely right at the time, hopefully, but I couldn't necessarily say totally hand on heart. And the problem is going back and working out who we consulted at that particular time, 10, 15 years ago would be potentially problematic. But I mean, as part of that, I think there was a flagged up requirement in respect of the schemes in Bingham to contribute money towards expanding the healthcare provision there. So we haven't just dreamt that up out of thin air. Somebody would have told us that there was a deficiency in places, or there would be on the back of the significant development there, and they would have come up with a cost figure that we then sort of negotiated with the developer. But in terms of the absolute detail, I mean, clearly, it requires me to look into that. I couldn't really comment on that, very specifically.
Councillor Chewings.
Thank you, Chair. Going back to what Councillor Solomon was stating with regards to the bridge over the A46 to link to Bingham, and obviously part of the development and the slipping of time and trigger points. Just to reiterate that point, in Cockgrave we've had a similar issue, and see Richard smirking over there. He's fully aware of this because it's taken a lot of. Yes, we've had many hours of debate at the town council on this, and it just to add to weight really to what Councillor Solomon was saying, in that we had planning application approved for Cockgrave, Significant and Holligate Lane back in March 2011. Part of that was 106 and planning conditions for a bridge to be built over a canal to link in. Yet 2014 is varied. Dates were ignored, and to be honest with you, I mean, the settlement's been now complete for a number of years and we're still waiting for that bridge. And we're here today to talk about ensuring that infrastructure is made to meet the needs of the developments. Yet there's examples within Newton, there's examples in Cockgrave, and I dare say if we go further within the borough, there'll be more examples. So it's all well and good planning ahead, but what are we doing as a council to ensure that legal requirements are met and enforced? We have actually an enforcement team for planning conditions, but we don't seem to do anything about it. So that's the first point. And I don't expect you to answer that now, Richard. I appreciate that it is detailed there, but it needs to be looked at. We look at planning ahead. So I think, give some examples of him, obviously, from Councillor Regan and the issues with the doctors at Bingham. And I can think of, we've got our nice new doctors at Cockgrave that was partly funded through 106 money and SIL money, which is about capacity. We have another 400 houses being built in Cockgrave and how that can be facilitated for. And it's that joined up thinking and moving forward. We further look at South Notts Academy in Radcliffe-on-Trent, which is the main secondary school for Radcliffe, but also for Cockgrave. Lovely school was built a couple of years back to meet the needs. Then due to development, they had to build an annex, which was completed in December, which is now full. There was a request that went in from the county council to take on more pupils, which has happened for this year alone. And my understanding from speaking to the head teacher, there's a possibility of further money for a further annex to be built on a school which is less than 5 years of age. So 2 annexes to meet the needs of the population growth. Now, for me, that doesn't come across as joined up thinking and planning ahead. So we do need to be looking at this once again. Refer back to obviously the IDP, which was done in 2013. 10 years past now, our needs and validity has changed since then, and we need to be looking at this quite urgently.
Thank you. I'm going to come to Councillor Solomon and then look to move on after that.
Thank you. I just wanted to pick up on my point again about trackability, and that feeds into exactly what Councillor Regan and Councillor Chewings have just said, to reiterate it. All these developments are complex. They take place over a number of different years, and during that time, staff come, staff go. And if these variations and applications and deadlines are not tracked and recorded properly, that knowledge is lost when someone moves on. So I would formally like to request a system that is put in place that tracks everything from the development. So, for example, Councillor Chewings, with outlining what happened in Cockgrave and certainly what's going on in Newton, then if you've got a summary, you can very easily just look at that summary and see what was the deadline, why hasn't this been built? And it enables you to review the situation without having to search through tons and tons of other documents and ask that person that left a few years ago. I'm just saying that needs to be in place, and that allows the council to be responsible, it's trackable and more agile to dealing with the issues that are thrown up by reviewing that simple summary. So I'm just asking, I think we need to have a formal process in place, and perhaps looking at historic developments like these ones that are outlined, to put all that together to work it out. So you've got a standard operating procedure to go forward. I don't know if you've got something in place already. If you have, I don't think it's working because there are still questions. So I would just make that a formal request, really.
Yeah, well, again, sorry, because I'm not directly involved with it, but I think what you are talking about, I think the planning team do operate something along those lines already. So with respect to when things go into the Section 106 agreement, like, yeah, various triggers, various requirements, that all gets set out into effectively a central database, so that the team know that after 2 years, the developer will need to do X, Y, and Z, or once the 100th house has been built, they need to do this. Otherwise, if we didn't do that, those things would just slip by, because the developers don't come forward and say, oh, by the way, I owe you £100,000. We have to go and tell them they owe £100,000. So whether it necessarily meets your expectations, I don't know, but it's that information does exist and it is tracked. So there should ultimately be an audit of why things have changed, where there is a variation to a Section 106 development scheme. All that detail is held within the system. Whether it's operating as it should do, that's another matter. But as far as I'm concerned, from my knowledge, is that those details are put in place and are monitored by the council officers. I mean, that's just on a wider point, if I may. I mean, ultimately, the council is dealing with, because we're not the infrastructure providers, so we are dealing, and as you say, officers change, requirements change. So often, and again, it's not an ideal perfect world, we'll get asked for one thing by an organisation at one point in time, and also they have sort of crystal ball in terms of what's going to be happening in 10 years when they tell us what they need now. So ultimately, sometimes it works well, sometimes less well, but unfortunately that's just the nature of the process, because there are a lot of bodies providing different bits and pieces in respect of health provision. The whole system can change in terms of who's responsible. So it's never going to be perfect at the end of the day. And there are going to be certain instances where, it's going a bit off track and you can get it back on course. Other times, unfortunately, there will be instances where it ultimately doesn't turn out to be perfect, and you can't necessarily always do something about that because you've set in place requirements 10 years previously, not knowing about birth rates in the future in respect to primary school places and whatever else.
Sorry,
Councillor, can you just hold on, because I think when looking at the recommendation in terms of commenting on the report, and also whether there are further related matters that the group wish to consider, seems fairly clear to me that the having considered this evening how the infrastructure is planned for, we need to move on to look at how the infrastructure is delivered. That, I think that will be something that we then, in terms of fulfilling the second aspect of the recommendation, that's what we asked for. And I would ask you, does that cover the additional point that you wanted to make?
I would just flag up, if you can't track it, you don't know what you're meant to deliver. And certainly the situation in Newton, I'm sure you're saying there's a system in place, but very clearly it hasn't worked in that particular instance. So things happen. I don't know what went wrong, but I do think it's worth having a look at that and why there isn't a clear record of what happened when and who was consulted. We're not, in the case of Newton, it's not asking for anything additional, it's just clarity on what has been agreed when. So I'm just saying, I think something in that trackability process you say is already there, just hasn't worked, and just want you to be mindful of that.
Sorry.
If I can just quickly respond. So as Richard said, there is a process in place. I think our planning team, as you may be aware, has grown over the last kind of couple of years. So we've now got I don't know his exact job title, but it's kind of responsible for the tracking and monitoring of Section 106 and SEAL contributions that come in. That post didn't exist a couple of years ago. And obviously now we've got the Newton Community Partnership Board set up and established, and hopefully that will help answer some of those questions and make sure that the parish council are engaged and the right processes are now in place. So obviously we can't change what's happened in the past, but we're hopefully now moving forward in a more positive direction with that.
Okay, thank you. So I think what I'm suggesting is, having sort of considered and commented that the recommendation goes forward on the basis that the further related matters that we wish to consider is how the infrastructure is monitored and tracked towards delivery.
Yeah, and bring it.
So here, yeah. Okay. If I propose that, and if Councillor Turing is seconding it, ask for those in favour. Thank you, and thank you, Richard. You're excused.
Thank you.
Have a good evening. So we move on now to item number 5, which is review of growth boards. And this hand over to Catherine when we've got the IT sorted out.
Yeah, sorry, bear with me. I'm attempting to multitask and currently failing.
Take your time. So just while that's happening, reminder of the recommendation, which is in 2 parts. Part A to consider the priorities identified for future boards, which would involve us suggesting potential other priorities, and part B, which is to consider, I think, initially the preferred option outlined in the report, and whether or not we will be put that forward for recommendation to Cabinet or have alternative suggestions.
Thank you. So I've got a quite a short presentation, I think, because there's quite a lot of detail in the report. So I'll try and skim through this, and that should allow a bit more time for questions and discussion. But I'm aware that some of you have been more involved in growth boards than others. So, and there was obviously some background information in the scrutiny paper and in the previous Cabinet report that outlined the process for the review. But just to sort of go over that a little bit, the growth boards were originally established in 2015, and they were for those of you that were around then, there was a sort of a board that was established in Cotgrave linked to the development that happened there, as we've already talked about this evening, and the redevelopment of the town centre and the colliery site development, and that was seeing that board brought together the developer, the parish council, the borough council, county council, and key partners in that area, and that was seen as a really good model for supporting a successful delivery of a growth of a kind of town. So there was identified that having growth boards in other areas that were having significant housing growth would be a good model to make sure that we are proactively planning for the development of those areas. So growth boards were originally established, and they've been reviewed since then a couple of times, and there's been tweaks to the numbers of growth boards. So Bingham and Rushcliffe-on-Trent, for example, was originally a joint growth board, and then it got separated because the priorities of those two areas kind of changed over time. There was the establishment of an East Leek growth board in 2017. So there's been tweaks along the way, and changes to the frequency of meetings and that kind of thing. So the growth boards that we have now, we've got Bingham, Fareham and West Bridgford that all meet quarterly, and we've got East Leek and Rushcliffe-on-Trent that meet twice a year, and they all report into our strategic growth board, which again meets quarterly, and that at the moment is continuing to meet. That met on Monday afternoon, and some of members here were at that meeting. So the boards have delivered quite a lot since they were established. This was covered in the Cabinet report, but I've just picked out a few things on the slide there. So that we did a quite an extensive master plan for the Bingham area called the Brilliant Bingham Master Plan, kind of looking at ways to link the new development to the north of the town with the existing town, things around accessibility, improvements to the town centre, that kind of thing. We did retail reviews in all growth board areas to help inform action plans. So that was kind of what is the existing offer in the town centre, how might we be able to enhance that, what support can we provide to the businesses, and that helped, as I've said, develop some of the action plans that are still in place for those growth board areas. We've engaged with Severn Trent Water in East Leek, and that's hopefully going to result in significant investment in the area. There's been a long-standing issue with sewage in East Leek. We've had a West Bridgford Commissioners report that was done. We had some independent commissioners come in and do some consultation with local businesses, local community groups, and the local community about what they thought West Bridgford needed, and that's resulted in the next bullet point, the establishment of West Bridgford Way, which is I suppose it's a website. It's like a tourist destination website, so it's got all the information about what West Bridgford has to offer, listings of local businesses, and we've got a supporting social media channel that promotes things that businesses are doing, offers that might be happening, events that we're doing, and we engage with local businesses as a part of that process. We've had a shopfront improvement grant scheme that's provided. We've had various iterations of the shopfront improvement grant scheme over the years. It's provided financial support to around 30 high street businesses across the borough. And then we've also had a high street digital grant in response to COVID, which provided financial support to around 35 businesses. And that was about getting them a new website or improvements to a website or a new social media presence and things like that. So we've done lots of different things for from the growth boards, some kind of direct delivery and some developments of plans and strategies that have then helped inform the work of those boards. In the report, I also outlined, because I think it's important that we consider these growth boards in the wider context of other work that the team and the Borough Council delivers around kind of support for business and economic growth and that kind of thing. So some of the things that were included in the report were around the recent establishment of the Newton Community Partnership Board, which I've already referenced this evening, which is supported by members of the economic growth team. We've also got the Sharp Hill stakeholders meeting, which has got a clear focus on the Sharp Hill or Ed Walton development. And that again is supported by members of the economic growth team. So the Fareham, Newton and Sharp Hill boards are not being considered as part of this review because they're more recently established and have quite a different focus to the sort of growth boards that I've been talking about, that kind of broader in their focus. We've got the Rushcliffe Parish Forum. Clearly, Rushcliffe is a big area of redevelopment in the borough, and it's taking quite a lot of time for officers engaging with various programmes that are happening there. But we have a parish forum that engages with local parish councils to keep them informed about everything that's happening with the Freeport, the development company, and the local development order. So they're engaged in that process as well. I've been previously to this board to talk about the UK Shared Prosperity Funding, and probably will be coming again in the near future, and the Rural England Prosperity Funding, which is a pot of funding that government has allocated to borough councils and city councils and mayoral combined authorities, replaces European funding, and the team are in the process of kind of administering all of that funding, directly commissioning activity that supports our businesses, and doing kind of got some big grant pots to support businesses and support community organisations and parish councils and things. So there's quite a lot of work involved in that, and quite a lot that we're doing to support the local area. We've got a Rushcliffe Business Partnership, which is a partnership, well, obviously, which is a sort of informal network of local businesses, so they can meet monthly and kind of share ideas and network with each other and do business with each other. So they meet twice a month, once in Buddington and once in West Bridgford, and we have a steering group that helps shape that work. And they also have quarterly events that they organise with guest speakers on particular topics. So we've got, as part of the business partnership, we've got about 1,500 businesses that are on our database that we can engage with. We have high street and town centre forums. They've been more successful in some areas than others. So I've mentioned already West Bridgford Way. So we organise meetings about quarterly with some of our high street businesses and talk about some of the events that are happening in Bridgford and how they might engage with those, and what they're thinking of doing and how the businesses can work together on different initiatives. We've established one in Bingham, which is going reasonably well, and then we've looked at that in other areas with mixed levels of interest, but it's something that we still continue to try and engage with businesses in different areas. We've recently established, following a cabinet report, the Bingham car parking stakeholder meeting. So that was identified in the cabinet report in September 2023. So that's something again that's kind of happened recently, and is a clear focused group looking at that car parking requirements in Bingham. And we have a big business carbon club. So we've brought together some of the bigger businesses. We don't have loads of big businesses in Rushcliffe. So when I say big business, I mean like 250 plus employees. We don't have a lot in Rushcliffe, but we've brought some of those together to look at what they're doing around their carbon emissions and how they can work together and support each other, but also be the champions for us and support their supply chains and local businesses in the borough with what they can do around reducing their carbon emissions and things like that. So if I can move on to the review itself, as outlined in the report, we did a survey of, so there was 2 surveys that we sent out, one that went to our existing growth board members as well as all councillors, and that had more detail about the growth boards themselves and what people's views of the growth boards were, what they thought priorities should be. So and then we had a second questionnaire that went to businesses, so our business database, about 2,500 businesses. But that focused really on what those businesses thought the priority should be for economic growth. Our thought being that if we started talking about growth boards, businesses might not really understand what we were talking about. So we wanted to really focus their attention on what they felt we should be prioritising and working on as an organisation and as a team. So some of the feedback, as you can see on the site, we had 14 responses from existing growth board members and councillors and 69 responses from local businesses. So it wasn't huge response rates, but it kind of gives us a bit of a flavour of what people might think. So some of the feedback included that the growth boards were good at bringing organisations together and making sure that everybody heard the same update at the same time on key projects and priorities in an area. People felt there was a need to review the kind of objectives of the growth boards and a need to engage businesses more because in some areas that was more of a challenge than in others because I think sometimes the focus of the boards wasn't in areas that maybe engage the businesses or interested the businesses. I think overall the view was that there'd been value in the growth boards, but based on identified priorities and considering other areas of work, it might be that existing boards don't have the right objectives and memberships in place. So there's been value in what they've done so far, but perhaps it's time to, as we are doing, sort of review that and think about how we can change that going forward. We did a review of the terms of reference of the growth boards as well, and as the report outlines, that identifies some areas of commonality and some areas of inconsistency, and I think as members will appreciate, as time goes by with some of these things, you write terms of reference when a board is established, and sometimes the scope drifts a little bit and membership changes over time, but the report set out some of those as it's written, the differences between the boards. So you can see from the slide, so this is the combined priorities that were identified from the businesses and from growth board members. I think obviously, as you will see, business support stands out as the main priority, but clearly that's influenced by the fact that we had 69 responses from local businesses, and of course they would like business support. But you can see there the kind of, and again, not a huge response, but the kind of others around inward investment and sustainability and green growth, employment and skills, and high streets and town centres are kind of quite consistently the same sort of level. So it gives you an indication of what people see as priorities. And I think something like tourism and place marketing didn't score so highly, but actually that's possibly also part of the high streets and town centres bit, because it kind of fits into that same sort of area of work, really. One of the other things that we covered in the report was around retail reviews. So I mentioned that we commissioned some retail reviews, I think in 2016, for the original growth boards. We've done a refresh of those, and they're being finalised at the moment. So we don't have them as complete reports yet, but hopefully we will do in the next month or so. But I've just picked out some headlines in the report around the fact that our vacancy rates are low across all of our town centres compared to regional and national averages, and there are a higher proportion of service and leisure businesses than the regional and national averages. So none of this is probably a surprise. It's not news, is it really? But the average footfall per month ranges from 86,000 to 1.3 million. So the 86,000 is Keyworth and 1.3 million is West Bridgford. So there's quite a significant difference, but you might expect that with a town centre like West Bridgford compared to somewhere like Keyworth. And then the number of independents is high in all of our town centres, ranging from 46% in West Bridgford to 62% in Ruddington. And they then provided, within the reports, they provided some ideas of areas of work that we could think about. So they've done some ideas of work across the whole of Rushcliffe, and then some town centre specific things. So some ideas that we could roll out in Radcliffe-on-Trent or Bingham or wherever. So things like landlord engagement campaigns, business support programmes, high street beautification, so public realm improvements, that kind of thing. And these are all things that we can feed into our kind of plans and any future growth boards or initiatives that we might want to do. So all of this will be useful information as we move forward with the growth boards. So in the report, I tried to get across the point really that I think with this review, what we're trying to do is make sure that we focus on economic priorities for Rushcliffe. So members might have picked up in papers for Corporate Overview Group recently that in the corporate strategy, one of the things that's been identified that we're going to be doing is developing an economic growth strategy for Rushcliffe. It's something that we've not had previously. And with things like mayoral combined authority, it's been identified that we think it's important that we have that strategy in place so we can show what our priorities are and if there is funding available where we think it should be channeled for Rushcliffe, and what we want to be supporting as a borough. And I think there's an opportunity with this review to make sure that whatever the structure is that is in place, it helps us support the delivery of any new strategy that we establish. So I think one of the things that we're trying to achieve really as well with the proposal is that the new structure is more flexible than the existing one. So the growth boards have been established for quite a long time, and they just kind of meet continually. And whilst that's been really useful to convene people, I think sometimes being able to have a more task and finish approach to meetings. So you've got a very clear objective, what that group is trying to achieve, and that might take a couple of years, but that's their objective, and then that group stops meeting and something else is established that focuses on a new area or a new priority. So that's what we're trying to do here. So that's this bit that I've highlighted there. This is likely to be determined by the type and nature of the matter being considered. So we're thinking about what we're trying to achieve, not really the structure. So that's where the focus is. Well, that's what we're hoping is what we've set out will achieve. So contained in the report, this is my last slide, is this was the preferred option. So this was included in the survey that went out to councillors and existing growth board members as the proposal for a new structure. So as it sets out, what the suggestion is that there would remain the strategic growth board that would meet and kind of set the direction for what the rest of the groups are working on and what the economic growth team and the council should be prioritising around economic growth. And then sitting underneath that, you'd have development boards. So as I've mentioned, the Fareham, Newton and Sharp Hill boards already exist. The Bingham Growth Board would switch to being a Bingham Development Board. I'm not set on these names. I've just said development board, and hopefully that's self-explanatory. So the Bingham board would then focus on that development specifically, and making sure that the developer is sat around the table with the parish council and others, similar to the Fareham, Newton and Sharp Hill meetings that we've set up. And then the Gamston one, as and when the Gamston development gets to a point that a board would be required. The new bit really is the task and finish groups. So as I've talked about, this is the bit where it can be flexed in response to what the identified priorities are emerging from the strategic growth board, from the economic growth strategy, and from the work that we're doing and the engagement that we have with members, with parish councillors, parish councils, that kind of thing. So I've just done an example of some types of things that we could do. You know, I've mentioned we've got some high street groups and forums. One of the things we've talked about is engaging landlords more in our town centres and high streets, because that can sometimes be a challenge, that there are absent landlords, and if there's a way that we can try and engage those and bring those together a bit more. Things around inward investment, we've got a lot of, as we've just been talking about, really a lot of housing development in Rushcliffe, and on each of our 6 strategic sites there is an allocation for employment land, and whilst the housing is getting delivered on most sites, the employment land tends to be the bit that lags behind. So bringing together some of those landowners, some commercial developers, some agents to try and get that development happening, and then, as I've said, area focused activity that's specific to a particular need in an area, and to make sure we maintain those relationships with our larger town and parish councils and the West Bridgford Local Area Forum meetings with those. I'm suggesting a couple of times a year. So that could be a smaller meeting of officers and ward members from the council and then the parish council, but that could then be extended depending on what was discussed. So, you know, if health was a priority or if education was, you could then have one of these separate task and finish groups established with wider membership included. So that's the, hopefully I've explained that. It feels like I might have complicated things, but yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. So just as a reminder, we've got a recommendation here in two parts. The first one is about considering the priorities that have been established, and then secondly, to try and form a collective view on the preferred approach. I thought there was a particularly neat turn of phrase in the report, which the focus is on what the council wants to achieve, not the structure which should follow after that. So turning first then to the priorities and that have been identified. I think there was that graph there at 420. Are there any, what comments do we have on that? Thank you, Councillor Wheeler.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to give a brief overview statement. I was on the Westbury Growth Board for a number of years. When you're going forward, may I suggest you're realistic with what you want to do. But the Westbury Growth Board has some really, in my view, rather ambitious but non-deliverable ideas. It just wasn't going to happen. And we put a lot of money into it. We put a lot of money into it. I mean, a lot of money into it. This is never going to happen because you said just now engaging with landlords. Well, didn't even want to engage with us. So we were then talking about doing things when you had landlords wouldn't even talk to us. So how are we going to do all these grand things when the landlords wouldn't even talk to us about the reshaping the layout of West Bridgeford, particular crossing just by the Chewy shop along there, centralise central West Bridgeford, which is never going to happen, create an underground car park. Come on. This is what I mean. You've really got to be focused when we're going forward and stop daft ideas going forward, which can't be delivered. There's no money to deliver these sort of schemes. And realistically, they won't happen. So I would just plead to whatever format, whatever system you use going forward, please keep this in check, because otherwise we just run away with ourselves again. This is good, that's good, let's do this, let's do that, let's do the other, and it ain't gonna happen. Seriously, it's not.
Yeah, I would agree with you. And I had a conversation with Councillor Grocott actually a couple of weeks ago about one of the things we talked about was the economic growth strategy, and thinking about actually what's our role in all of this. Is it, are we actually directly delivering something, in which case do we have the funding to do it, or are we actually just convening people to the right organisations to talk about something and try and move a project forward, or are we influencing in some way government or another organisation? So I agree with you, and I think it's about understanding what our role is and then who we need to bring around the table to try and make things happen. But yes, not getting lots of commissioning, lots of reports that identify lots of things that aren't deliverable. And that's what we've tried to do with the retail reviews. Let's identify things that aren't going to cost hundreds of millions of pounds to do, because we don't have that money and we've struggled to attract that money from government.
Chairman, just to have a final comment, sorry, it will be a final comment. Keep it simple. As you go along this course, you can develop those simple ideas into maybe something bigger and grander if required. But where the group was enrolled, we came up with these fantastic ideas which are never going to work without having testing to see whether it could be delivered. So please don't make that mistake again.
Thank you, Councillor Wheeler. Councillor Grocott.
I'd echo the points that Councillor Wheeler's made there. Exactly that. And relating to our conversation, Catherine, just an observation. These seem to be the right kind of priorities that we should be considering as growth boards. I've noticed that the term growth in Rushcliffe seems to have a very broad interpretation, because we start talking about education, we start talking about housing, we stray into potentially quite large scale what I would call physical regeneration project rather than economic growth. I know that economic growth is a broad concept potentially, but this is about the council's role as a facilitator of economic development specifically. So I would warn against large scale placemaking being brought into the activities of the growth board. So discussing wider things like health needs, wider things like education needs. Inevitably, you are going to touch on some of those, but you want these boards to be focused on a set of priorities which particularly relate to economic growth. And you've got them all there. They're all pretty much there in those responses, those headings that you put out. I don't know if there was anything major in other, or it was just like one random response from each business, but I think you pretty much nailed the priorities there. And in relation to what we were saying, you know, that middle strand on the next slide, you are going to need a lot of external expertise. I mean, I'm thinking about business support there. The largest amount of business support available in Rushcliffe has been commissioned through the Joint County UK SPS scheme, and it's gone to the East Midlands Chamber of Commerce. That is the organisation that is here to provide business support to Rushcliffe. So if there's ways in which we can facilitate and convene their engagement with this agenda, I think you'll have a lot of support. Sorry, I know you don't want to talk about structure, but in terms of priorities, I think those are right. My only other comment was on the, and this is a bit more parochial to my own ward rather than my area of professional expertise. I think, and we did touch on this in the recent full council meeting, some of those meetings with the larger town councils, if we're talking about growth, we need to be considering the economic areas that those towns impact upon. So I don't represent an area that is in any of the major settlements within the borough, but my ward is heavily affected by what happens in terms of growth in Bingham specifically. So if there is a way in which if we're going to hold them regularly, it wasn't just the main parish councils, but the main parish and town councils, but we could almost draw, similar to we had those sort of areas on the map, and have here's our northeast Rushcliffe one, here's our northwest Rushcliffe one, so that actually it's Bingham plus Newton, East Bridgeford, Cranmer, Cropwell, etc., that sort of thing. When you have that level of engagement, that's all from me, Chair. Thanks.
Anything else on the priorities, or should we get stuck into the structure? Okay. Yeah. Just before we do, I think I would like to make one observation linked to what Councillor Grocott just said, which is about the potential distinction between effectively what we're saying are development boards, and are they really about economic growth, or are they about housing delivery? And if they are about housing delivery, and I've got you know, a now extensive knowledge of how the Fareham one works, and that is in and of itself has proved to be an excellent way of dealing with the delivery, shall we say, but it isn't really about economic growth. So does that need to, does it need to sit under this umbrella, or would it be better off that the housing delivery ones, would they be better off sitting elsewhere?
It's a good question. I suppose potentially yes, but at the moment, the Fareham and the others report into the Strategic Growth Board. So Paul Taylor comes to the Strategic Growth Board and does an update on our big development sites. I suppose if the Strategic Growth Board is taking that, it depends on the remit of the Strategic Growth Board, I guess, because if that's taking that wider remit around place shaping, as Councillor Grocott just referenced, then they should sit there. But if the remit of the Strategic Growth Board is economic growth, then they shouldn't.
Just to offer some guidance potentially on a solution to that, I think you could have housing development is economic growth. I don't want to this is difficult trying to cut up thematic things and put them into different boxes. So I wouldn't necessarily say that we don't need to have that considered. And of course, the infrastructural impact of what happens on those development boards will have a major impact on economic growth. Absolutely. So I think they probably do still need to exist somewhere within this structure. It could be that the task and finish groups that we're talking about in that middle strand become the strands that almost focus on those priority areas that you are identifying there. So actually you have your development boards that are still dealing with the actual physical placemaking infrastructure, etc., etc. But the task and finish group structure is where you have your expertise aligned to those more narrow areas of what let's call revenue-based economic activity, not the capital spend that we do on houses and infrastructure and physical regeneration, but the different services that are available to businesses and to residents, and to support initiatives around green growth, etc., etc.
Thank you. which I think is essentially what's being proposed at the moment. So, Councillor Chewings.
Thank you, Chair. A couple of points. First of all, just with regards to development boards, what would the membership of each of those boards look like? I noticed from reading the report that depending on which previous board there was, it was different membership, whether it was ward councillors were present, sometimes there were, sometimes there wasn't, sometimes the parish council. So what is the envisagement of these new boards? So I appreciate we've got a couple already in situ, but moving forward, will it be the town councils, with the ward members, etc.?
Yes, all of those. So if you follow if we take Fareham as an example, you would have the borough council ward members, town council, and developers, and potentially people like county highways, that kind of thing. So yes, you would have both borough council, ward members, and town council.
Thank you. Come to Gamston then, because it's called Gamston, but if you look at where it sits within the wards, it's actually in Tollerton, isn't it? So it's just to make mindful that it sits within Tollerton rather than Gamston, but we call it Gamston. I might ask, it makes it look more attractive when it comes to selling those houses down the line when they're built, but we need to have alignment to obviously understanding where they sit. That is it on development boards. I've got a couple of questions on the 6 largest town parish councils area. I'm doing that now. So who are they? Because some people might think they're sitting the 6th largest, and some might be surprised that they're not. So who are those 6 largest areas? And more importantly, how will that be reviewed? And I think I look at Councillor Way. If you look at Eastleigh, for example, if you go back 10 years ago, it wouldn't have been in the top 6 in size, but now it definitely is. And that's where it needs to be looked at. So who are the top 6 largest communities or developments at this moment in time? And is there going to be a way to make sure that is kept up to date?
Now you're testing me now, aren't you? So Bingham, Cotgrave, Eastleigh, Rushcliffe-on-Trent, Ruddington, and Keyworth would be the 6 at the moment. But yes, absolutely. So it for a while, the Borough Council has had a link officer or link officers whose responsibility is to go and meet with the parish clerk on a regular-ish basis to just check in and see if they're okay, if there are any priorities, any issues that they want to raise. For the last year or so, that's been me, because of my role on the growth boards. That kind of engagement has been happening anyway. But so this is kind of an enhancement of that, and engagement with other people. So that's kind of where that idea has come from. So I don't envisage it will be me now in future for all 6 of them, because that'll be quite a lot, but it'll be, service manager or one of the directors that will be involved in those discussions. But yeah, that's the 6. But yes, that can be kept under review if there is a particular issue. So it's not, again, it kind of falls into the middle bit of the task and finish group, that if the strategic growth board or another identifies a particular priority or an area of concern, we can bring the right people together to try and deal with that issue as it arises.
And one assumes if you, for example, convene a task and finish group on viability of town centres, then you're going to be asking those 6 areas, representatives from those 6 areas that have high streets. So that they're the biannual meetings there aren't going to be the only opportunity for those people to be involved in what the borough is doing in relation to economic growth.
Yes.
Councillor Solomon.
Yeah, I'm looking for a bit of clarity, really, around Newton specifically. So there's the Newton Community Partnership Board, which has taken a long time to set up, but we're there. How does that fit into the structure? And a high street in Newton, yeah, there isn't one, and there isn't going to be one for a long time. And what I know they're looking to develop wouldn't ever be a traditional high street anyway. So yeah, the Community Partnership Board, how does that fit into the structure?
I think this is the point that was sort of made earlier, really, about the development boards and their different remits. The development boards are really about working with the developer on a new housing development to make sure that is delivered in the right way, in the way that it should have been according to the planning. So that's then different to the task and finish group. So the development boards don't have an economic growth focus. It's about place shaping and that wider delivery and infrastructure and everything else that goes with a new housing development.
So what you're saying to me, what I think I'm hearing, is that the Newton Community Partnership Board is the development board. It's that.
Yes.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
That's
sorry.
fine.
Yes.
Yeah, that is that. That's how that fits into that structure. But on top of that, there's going to be a strategic growth board.
The strategic growth board already exists. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Councillor Butler.
Well, very briefly, really, I think we're sort of answering a lot of questions anyway, but however it does finish up, it's very important that the way we present it and explain it to the parishes and all the other people who will be coming along to these, because we've seen it in the past that there's a danger of, especially when you've got external people, business people in particular coming along, they might start wondering, what am I doing here? And also what difference are they, and indeed the board's, going to make. So it needs to be very clear on its remit when it's been decided, and also not to, I'm not suggesting for one moment this would happen, but it's like anything like this, just be very careful not to sort of fall into the danger of over-promising and under-delivering, or saying we can do this like tomorrow, when in reality we know a lot of things, especially in our world, can take quite a frustratingly length of time. So I just think we need to keep that in mind. But I think that that's all looking pretty good as it is.
Thank you. Councillor Groscock and then Councillor Way.
Thank you. I'm finding it to some extent difficult to distinguish between these development boards and task and finish groups and so on, because to me they go hand in hand. If you have a housing development, it's inevitably going to impact in some way on the high streets and the economy of the local area. So I'd like to know how you feel those would divide up. And also I think the idea of having a flexible approach, so that if there's a particular issue that arrives in one of the communities, for example, the Bingham car park issue, that there's a flexibility to be able to set up a board, a group, whatever you want to call it, to bring together the people that are most relevant to that issue, but also with the ability to include others as necessary as it goes on.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There is crossover between some of these. So the Bingham development is a good example of that. So the Bingham development, part of the Bingham Growth Board, the developer came to the Growth Board meetings and gave updates. So this would be slightly switching the focus, that they would be the focus really, and they would be talking about their development. But a key part of that would be how that's linking into the town centre. So there would be some crossover of what's discussed at a development board, and then potentially a task and finish group. But the role of us as officers supporting that would be to make sure that is joined up and aligned across those different groups, and we're not having the same conversation in lots of different forums and formats. So that's that, I suppose. And then, yes, in terms of the flexibility, absolutely. The idea is that we can have a board that responds to something, not necessarily board forum, whatever you want to call them, that responds to a particular issue. I think what I would say on that is it's not always necessarily the Borough Council that is the right organisation to lead that group. We need to bear in mind resources. So it might be that there's a parish council led thing, or it's a health led thing, or it's an education led thing, or whoever it might be. So it'd just be about whatever the particular issue is and who's the right person to be leading on that.
The big economic growth show in town isn't on there. So how does the power station redevelopment fit into this model?
That should have been on my development board's list, because there is the parish updates that we organise as part of that. So yes, that should. And there was a member working group for the for the Development Corporation, but that's not been listed this time round. But that can be something that's, again, you know, we can bring together people as we need to for Ratcliffe. As you know, the leader and Kath are very involved in discussions with Development Corporation and the Freeport, and making sure those discussions are joined up.
So, Councillor Groscock and then Councillor Chewings.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. A possible answer, and you have answered it, Catherine, that it's just missing from the list. But just a point of clarity, the task and finish groups, some of those priority areas that were on the other screen, they would benefit from almost not, and I'm just check my understanding. The task and finish groups would benefit from being thematic and borough-wide. So, in other words, you have a narrow focus on employment and skills across the borough. You have a narrow focus on high streets across the borough. You have a narrow focus on inward investment across the borough in those task and finish groups, in which you actually have the experts in those particular themes collaborating with local representatives. We would then presume some of whom would then sit on development boards and or the 6 largest organisations, and that's where you get your cross-pollination. I've drawn a really sophisticated diagram here that you can see, and it's like that axis. If you've got the development board here, then you've got thematic task and finish group across. So you've got Bingham, you've got Newton, you've got Fareham, etc. Then you've got those other place-based entities over here. So effectively, you have 2 types of place-based focus there, and then the middle one is a thematic-based focus rather than focused on place. Is my understanding completely crazy here, Catherine, or is that sort of, or in a way where we're kind of going with this? Sorry.
Yeah, if you can give me that diagram afterwards, that'd be really helpful. Yeah, no, that's right, basically. So I have put area focused activity in the task and finish groups, and really that was where there's a particular high street or town centre that might need some support or some extra work. Absolutely. Yes, absolutely.
Councillor Chewings.
Thank you, Chair. Just going back to the diagram of the board, I'm in favour of it. Be quite clear on that. But one concern sort of raised really. So obviously we've got at different areas, development boards, the largest towns, and the task and finish. Now I'm right in thinking that development board might want some tasks to then feed into the strategic board, or the largest towns might have some tasks feed into the strategic board, which will then make a decision and then feed down to the task and finishing groups. Is that right thinking? Great, which works. However, how long will that take? If each one of those is meeting every quarter, you could potentially, the development board could meet, then 2 months later, the strategic board meets, but then it's missed the task and finishing meeting. So then it's another 2 months later. Before you know it, you're 6-7 months down the line. So I agree there needs to be governance from the strategic growth board, but we need to have an understanding that that structure could cause undue delay. And so we need to have some safeguards in place to prevent that, to make sure the timing is in place so that if something does come from one area to go to the strategic board, it can be tasked out quickly rather than having to sit there waiting.
I suppose I'd say in response to that the development boards aren't really decision making. So I think that the developer comes and provides updates. I don't think there's anything then that would need to go to the strategic growth board for decision. It's more of an update that is provided at the moment. Okay, yeah. So I think in that instance, I wouldn't expect us to have to be waiting for another cycle of meetings. If there was something that we needed a decision on, we can take those in between meetings by consulting via email or whatever it might be. I wouldn't expect a structured delay some activity that we wanted to deliver or something that we wanted to do. So take, for example, the Strategic Growth Board, as it stands at the moment, has a small pot of money that it allocates to projects. So anything £10,000 and under, the leader as chair of Strategic Growth Board can sign off whether or not he approves that funding bid that's come forward. And the maximum we can award is 25,000. Anything above £10,000 is a decision for the Strategic Growth Board, but that can be done via email in between meetings. So it's like, does everybody agree with this? Let me know by X date. If I haven't heard from you, I'll assume it's positive.
Thank you, that answers that concern. Thank you.
And what I'm hearing is no scrutiny matrix requirements to go into the strategic growth board 3 months before the and some of those frustrations that some of us might have felt in bringing items for some items for scrutiny. But anyway, there we are. Councillor Solomon.
Sorry, I'm going to go back to structure again because I'm struggling with this, because you said that a growth board for Newton already exists. It doesn't. There isn't, like, sorry. So the development board, under that heading, there's a community partnership board within Newton, and that's focusing on the housing development. So you're saying above that is a strategic growth board based for economic growth. In the document 4.29, we've looked up, it says Newton already in place, that there's a growth board for Newton already in place. I'm not aware of that.
Oh, sorry. If it says there's a growth board already in place for Newton, that's incorrect in the report. What I was referring to is the community partnership board. So when I've referenced Newton there, and as I said, I've called them development boards and growth boards throughout, but it doesn't have to be. It's not a development board. In Newton, it's the community partnership board.
Right, so that's already in place. So are you recommending that a strategic growth board for Newton is then put in place in addition?
No, the strategic growth board already exists and sits across everything. I'm suggesting that the Newton Community Partnership Board, like Fareham, like Sharp Hill, like Gamston, reports into the strategic growth board. But by that I just mean that Paul Taylor or somebody will come and do an update about what's happening on the Newton development site. So the strategic growth board already exists. It's not specific for Newton. It's across the whole borough.
Okay.
Councillor Butler.
Dare I say, it goes back to the point I was making. We've got to be absolutely clear as to what these are for, who does what, and who's going to be on them. Because otherwise, there's a real danger if people get confused out there, especially non-council people. They'll walk away and they won't be interested, and they will, and it will potentially just knock everything on the head, and we'll step back. So, just making a point, really.
Councillor Regan.
I'm learning a lot tonight. So the recommendations are for these 2 points, A and B. We've talked a lot about the process. I'm absolutely in favour of being process oriented with tasks, objectives, and actions that are measurable, which I think has been discussed and mentioned. However, point A refers to paragraph 4.2, which is the combined basic priorities. And you said there was quite a small response, and only 69 businesses and 14 external parties or councillors or contributed. So it feels to me that this entire structure is based on quite a small amount of input data. And Councillor Chewing's asked a question about how the boards are structured, and it seems like it's entirely public to organisations or people within the public sector, which obviously councillors that come from the private sector, but there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of private sector engagement in this. And it seems like one of the outcomes is what happened in West Bridgford, where landlords reject engagement because they have other priorities, and then the whole thing becomes quite an internal cyclone of conversations and decisions that potentially don't result in constructive or positive action in the business community.
Which is the reason for really, I think, separating out what is the development boards, that is about place shaping and is about the public sector coming together and making sure we deliver the right thing. And then the task and finish groups that will be more focused on those kind of specific objectives and themes. So the high street, that'll be bringing businesses together. Landlord engagements will be bringing landlords together. So you're trying to, as Councillor Butler's just said, engage people in what is going to be of interest to them. I think the growth boards previously that have existed have had quite a wide remit covering lots of different things. And because the main people sitting around the table have been the public sector, that has been those kind of conversations perhaps have put off some people in the private sector to engage. The business engagement has been good in some areas, but lower in other areas. And I think by separating it out, it means that we can really tailor those conversations and get the right people around the table that we need to develop plans and that are informed. I agree with you that the response rate is low. I think what I would say is the task and finish groups, these priorities, they're not set in stone. This is just a starting point, and gives us some useful insight to thinking about an economic growth strategy. But as part of an economic growth strategy, we'll be doing quite a lot of looking at what the data tells us around who our businesses are, who our people are, what skills they've got, all that kind of thing. So this is just a starting point, and it was to get an input from existing growth board members and our businesses, and obviously this evening from you all, if you think there's obvious things from this list linked to economic growth that we're missing, but it's an ongoing conversation.
Thank you. If we could, if there could be greater engagement with the councillors and bring them into the process and allow them to communicate to the towns that are on the list there on the left, that would be incredibly helpful, I think.
Sorry, in the town and parish council meetings, that. Oh right, yes, yeah. So the ward members would be involved in those, the relevant ward members in those development boards.
Just speaking from my own experience in relation to the Fairham board, it's a brilliant way for previously me and now Andy and I to have I think meaningful input, eyeballing the relevant, the important relevant people saying this is what we need. So if that's repeated elsewhere, then I think you will feel properly involved and engaged in that process. Councillor Way.
Thank you, Chair. Somebody mentioned about going from one meeting to other and things taking a long time. Correct me if I'm wrong, Catherine, but these seem completely different things to me. The development boards seem to be a process of giving information, correct? So that the developers come along and talk to a group of people, and I think it's establishing what that group of people consists of is quite important there. Whereas the task and finish groups are alongside that and not necessarily linked to it in terms of timing their tasking and finishing, but need to be linked to oncoming developments, perhaps in existing communities. Most of these here, in fact, all of these here are new developments, although Bingham's an add-on to an existing community. And I think there's a big difference there between having a development of a completely new community, as in Fareham, where you can have a lot of input, and something that's been added on. And this links in with what we were talking about in the first part of the meeting with Richard Mapletoft about the S106 agreements. And I think possibly that's where the development boards would come in, or it would have to perhaps be something else for the existing communities, where they get that opportunity to hopefully, as Councillor Solomon said, keep a check on what's happening and is it happening in a timely fashion. Whereas the meetings with the large town and parish councils just seem to me like a very good way of a communication between a specific community and the borough council. I would say one-to-one, but I don't mean one-to-one. I mean the council and an officer. But I also think they need to, as somebody else said, encompass the area around that. So I represent Eastleek, but I also represent Westleek. And before the change of boundaries, I represented Stamford-on-Soar and Normanton. And they're quite small communities, and they're as deserving of representation as anybody else. So things like the meeting with the 6 largest towns, I think, should include the areas around them. We don't want to miss people out here, I don't think.
Okay, Councillor Chewings.
Thank you, Chair. I'll keep it short. It's just an observation really with regards to the term development board. And I know, Catherine, you said you're not pressed on that term, but I think it's quite clear tonight. I think if we go wider the community, if you said a development board, people have a vision that that board would be able to steer that development, which isn't the case. So just, I think we need to look at that terminology, review board, update board, or whatever, just to change that terminology to make it more clear actually what the purpose is. So somebody reads it, they know what it means rather than what it is at the moment. Fully in support of it. I think actually we've debated it quite well. I think there seems to be a broad acceptance of this. Can I move that we take it to the vote, please?
Yeah, happy to. With what one comment that I have felt that on the Fairham, what was called Growth Board, you know, we have generated outcomes that have steered the development in ways that it might not have gone if that board wasn't there. So good luck coming up with a name that with a name that fits. Councillor Solomon, are you seconding the?
Well, I can do, but I was just going to reiterate what you're saying about your experience with the community group with Fairham. So there's obviously a Bingham Community Partnership Board. Sorry, not a Bingham Community Partnership Board, a Newton Community Partnership Board. Newton's next to Bingham, and just reiterating really that is a fantastic forum where all parties in having a stake in the development come together, and it's certainly been a really positive way to discuss issues and drive things forward in a positive way. So just reiterating that they are incredibly valuable. So I've had that same experience as you.
Okay, well, with some good positive, heartwarming note to send us off into the autumnal night. So I think Councillor Solomon has a second the recommendation. So all those in favour? Aren't we a harmonious bunch? So moving on then to the work programme.
So we've got our next meeting is the 3rd of January, and we've got sewerage infrastructure and discharge within Rushcliffe. So this is the second time this has come to the board, to the group, sorry, and this time I think the focus is having Nottinghamshire County Council as lead local flood authority to come. We had Environment Agency and Severn Trent Water come last time, so that was felt by members that was the missing bit. And then we've got management of open spaces as the other item. We've got nothing at the moment on March, so I don't know if we want to slot in the monitoring and tracking the delivery infrastructure item in there. And then July, we've got the review of the crematorium coming back after we had it at the last meeting.
Thank you. I'll try and resist the temptation to do a gag about councillors talking crap in January, but there we are. So yes, I think in March, the item that we've talked about today in terms of monitoring and delivery, and it's always a good time to remind us that if there are other things not previously mentioned or on the list that we want to bring forward for scrutiny, then you're obviously welcome to do that on individually, or if you'd like Councillor Way and I to take that forward to the corporate overview group ourselves, then please let us know.
I'd just say the one that I've mentioned already this evening is the economic growth strategy, so a draft or version of that perhaps in March.
Okay.
It gives me a deadline to work to.
March, which March? Sorry, Councillor Ways wants to...
I just wanted to say the review of the crematorium in July. We did ask for a visit, and Councillor Grocock and I went to visit the crematorium. If you haven't been before, Rhonda is very welcoming and would like anybody to make an appointment to go and see her and visit the place. I was very apprehensive about going, but I must say it was a beautiful place. It is, yes. I didn't do the back room, and the team there are fantastic.
No, you can't say what you're going to say, Chairman.
Well, I think Councillor Tring is going to save me. Is going to drag me out of this hole that I might have found otherwise found myself in.
Just quickly, I fully agree with the programme and obviously suggestions from Catherine for the March editions. I think it'll work very well. Obviously, we've got the crematorium down for July, and we said we want to give them some time to get up and running, and so we see where they're at. Great. I'm just mindful of the actions available. One of them was obviously, which Councillor Waits talked about, attending the crematorium. I've been already prior to that meeting and agree with sentiment. We've still got the other action with regards to the costings and the clarification. I noticed we've still not got that information.
It is a work in progress. So we have had a lot of meetings between ourselves and finance over the last kind of month or so. So we're running different models to see for the business plan, to see what we need to do and to change over the next 5 years, and that will help inform what our payback period will be, which I think was what the question was, and what the return is. So at the moment, the crematorium is projected to it's making a profit this year. We're not making a loss as it stands at the moment, is what is projected. But in terms of the rate of return, that's work that we're doing. And I've got a meeting in the morning actually with Pete Linfield and Leanne about that. So we're working towards finalising some things. Obviously, we're aware of budgets needing to be finalised. So we will have that information within the next couple of months, but just bear with us.
Well, thank you, everybody. Close the meeting and wish